She stood outside her husband's study with a secret in her hand and a child beneath her heart. Clara had come home, ready to tell Vincent DeLuca, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, that he was going to be a father. But before she could open the door, she heard the words that shattered everything. He said he would only tolerate her until she gave him a son. After that, she could disappear, but the child would stay with him. And Clara heard every cruel word. Welcome back to the channel, where we tell powerful mafia boss stories about love, betrayal, loyalty, family, and the dangerous price of power. Some men are born to rule, but some women are born to survive them. This story is not just about revenge. It is about self-respect, motherhood, courage, and the strength to protect a child from a world that measures worth by bloodline. Stay until the end, because the child Vincent never wanted may become the one who saves what is left of his soul. If this story touches you, comment where you're watching from, share it, and subscribe for more emotional mafia stories.
The rain had been falling over North Jersey since late afternoon, soft at first, then harder as the evening settled over the DeLuca estate. By 9 o'clock, the windows of the mansion were dark mirrors, reflecting chandeliers, marble floors, and the kind of silence that only existed in houses where people were paid to disappear before they were noticed. Clara Hart DeLuca stood at the end of the second-floor hallway, with a sealed medical envelope in her hand. She had held that envelope the entire drive home from Philadelphia. Her fingers had pressed so tightly against the paper that one corner had bent beneath her thumb. Inside were 3 pages from a private clinic, printed in clean black ink, saying what Clara still could not quite say out loud. She was pregnant, 6 weeks, still early, still fragile, still small enough to feel like a secret whispered inside her body. The doctor had smiled gently when she gave Clara the news, then warned her to take things slowly. Her blood pressure was higher than they liked. Stress would not help. She needed rest, regular appointments, and support. Support. Clara had almost laughed when the doctor said that word. In the DeLuca mansion, support meant security guards at every gate, drivers who knew where she went before she arrived, and a husband powerful enough to make half the city lower its voice when his name was spoken. But it did not mean warmth. It did not mean tenderness. It did not mean someone reaching for her hand before she had to ask. Still, on the ride home, Clara had let herself imagine it, not some dramatic scene. She was not that foolish. She did not expect Vincent DeLuca to cry, or spin her around the room, or fall to his knees like men did in movies made by people who had never lived inside a marriage built like a contract. But maybe he would soften. Maybe he would look at her differently. Maybe, for one moment, he would see her not as a debt settled, not as a wife placed beside him for appearances, not as another piece of the DeLuca name polished for public view. Maybe he would see the mother of his child. The hallway outside his private study was dim, lit only by 2 wall sconces and a strip of gold light coming from beneath the closed door. Clara stopped when she heard voices inside. Vincent's voice came first, low, controlled, familiar in the way winter is familiar when you have lived through too many cold seasons. "I'll tolerate her until she gives me a son." Clara went still. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. The rain struck the windows. Somewhere downstairs, a clock ticked with painful patience. She stood with one hand on the envelope, the other slowly moving to her stomach. Inside the study, Frank Bellamy, Vincent's consigliere, said something Clara could not make out. Vincent answered clearly. After that, she can live wherever she wants. The child stays with me. The words did not hit her all at once. They entered slowly, one by one, each finding a place inside her where hope had been hiding. "I'll tolerate her until she gives me a son. The child stays with me." Clara did not move. She did not breathe deeply enough to make a sound. The hallway felt suddenly too long, the walls too close, the house too quiet for the violence of what had just been said. Frank spoke again, his tone careful. "And if it isn't a boy?" There was a pause. It lasted only a second, maybe 2. But Clara felt the full weight of it. Vincent said, "Then we try again." Her fingers tightened around the envelope. She wanted to open the door. She wanted to step inside and make him look at her. She wanted to throw the medical papers at his polished desk and watch that calm, unreadable face crack under the truth. But something stopped her. Not fear, something colder. Clarity. If she walked in now, she would give him her shock while it was fresh. She would give him her tears. She would give him the first chance to explain, to deny, to twist his words into something less ugly than what they were. Clara had been raised around powerful men. Her father had been one. Vincent was one. She knew how men like that survived their own cruelty. They renamed it, they called it duty, pressure, strategy, tradition. They made the wound sound practical. So Clara stepped back, one step, then another. She turned before her knees could fail her and walked away from the study, her face calm. Her hand resting over the life Vincent did not yet know existed. In her bedroom, she closed the door softly behind her. She did not lock it, not yet. Locking it would mean something had changed, and Clara was not ready for the house to know. She placed the envelope on her vanity and stared at it. 6 weeks pregnant, a child. Not an heir, not a son, not a future capo wrapped in a blue blanket and handed to a man who thought bloodlines mattered more than women, a child. Her child. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her coat, still feeling the cold from outside clinging to her sleeves. She waited for tears, but they did not come. The pain was too sharp for crying. It had gone past sadness and settled somewhere deeper. Somewhere quiet. That was the first thing Vincent took from her that night. Not love. She had stopped expecting that months ago. He took the last little piece of hope she had been foolish enough to keep. The next morning, breakfast was served at 8, as always. The dining room was long, pale, and perfect. White roses stood in a crystal vase at the center of the table. Silverware sat in exact lines. Coffee steamed in a Thompson cup beside Vicente's right hand as he read through a folder of reports. Clara sat across from him, with tea she had no intention of drinking. Vincent did not look up immediately. "You slept late." "I slept enough," Clara said. He turned a page. "You don't usually miss the first tray, no." That made him glance at her, only briefly. His eyes were dark, assessing. Vincent DeLuca noticed things for a living. A nervous accountant, a lying dock manager, a politician pretending not to be afraid. He could read hesitation in a handshake and betrayal in the way a man avoided eye contact. But he looked at his wife and saw nothing. Or maybe he saw what he expected to see: Clara, quiet and elegant, sitting exactly where the DeLuca wife was supposed to sit. That hurt more than if he had known and ignored it. It meant he had never been close enough to notice when she disappeared from him. "Are you feeling unwell?" he asked. For one wild second, Clara wondered what he would do if she told him the truth right there. "I am pregnant. I heard you. I know what I am to you instead." She folded her napkin beside her plate and said, "No, I finally understand what this marriage is." Vincent looked at her then, really looked. Something moved behind his eyes, not concern exactly, but attention. Clara almost smiled. There it was, not love, not guilt, but attention. The only language men like Vincent respected. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked. "It means I won't mistake comfort for kindness anymore." The room went quiet. One of the maids near the wall lowered her eyes. Vincent's expression did not change, but his hand stilled on the folder. Clara stood. "I have an appointment this morning." "With whom?" She picked up her purse. "A friend." Vincent did not like that answer. She could feel it in the air, but he did not stop her. Not yet. Upstairs. Clara closed herself in the small sitting room attached to her bedroom. It was the only room in the mansion that felt somewhat hers. There were books she had chosen, a cream-colored chair near the window, and a writing desk Vincent never used because it was too delicate for him. She took out her phone and called Grace Miller. Grace answered on the fourth ring, her voice bright at first. "Clara, you recalling before noon. Either someone died or you finally decided to divorce the Marble Palace." Clara closed her eyes. "Grace, I need legal advice," quietly. The brightness vanished. "Is this about Vincent?" Clara looked down at her stomach. "It's about my child." Silence stretched through the line. Then Grace said much more softly, "Clara, are you pregnant?" "Yes." "Does he know?" "No." Grace exhaled. "Okay, listen to me. Do not tell him yet. Not until I see the marriage agreement." Clara opened her eyes. "You think it's that bad?" "I think men like Vincent don't sign contracts without making sure the exits belong to them." That sentence settled over Clara like a second diagnosis. After the call, she remained at the desk for a long time. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still gray, pressing low against the windows. Somewhere below, a car pulled up the driveway. Menaced voices rose, then faded. Life in the mansion continued. That was the cruelest part. Nothing in the house knew her world had changed. That night, Clara waited until the hallways were empty. Then she walked back to the second floor, to the study door where she had stood the night before. The light beneath it was gone now. Vincent was elsewhere in the house, maybe in the library, maybe in his office downstairs, maybe giving orders that could ruin lives before breakfast. Clara stood in the exact place where she had heard him. For a moment, she let herself feel it again, not because she wanted the pain, because pain, when remembered clearly, could become protection. She pulled a small notebook from the pocket of her robe. It was bound in brown leather, a gift from Grace years ago. Clara had never used it for anything important, until now. She opened to the first page and wrote the date. Then, slowly, carefully, she wrote every word she remembered. I'll tolerate her until she gives me a son. After that, she can live wherever she wants. The child stays with me. She stared at the page until the ink dried. Then beneath those words, she wrote one sentence of her own. He will not decide what my child is worth. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Grace. Clara answered without speaking. Grace did not waste time. I found something, she said. And Clara, before we talk about leaving him, I need every page of that contract. Not the copy they gave you. The original. Clara looked at the closed study door. For the first time since she had heard Vincent's words, her hand did not shake. Then I'll get it, she said, and in the quiet mansion built by men who thought women only endured, Clara De Luca made her first decision as a mother. By morning, Clara had already learned the first rule of surviving inside the De Luca house. Never let them know when they have wounded you deeply enough to make you dangerous. She woke before dawn. Though she had barely slept, the mansion was still dark, wrapped in that strange silence that came before the staff began moving through the halls. For a few minutes, Clara lay in bed with one hand resting over her stomach and the other curled beneath her cheek. She listened to the faint hum of the heating system, the distant sound of rainwater dripping from the gutters, and the steady beat of her own heart. A child was growing inside her. That truth should have filled the room with wonder. Instead, it had become something she needed to hide, not forever. Clara knew that a pregnancy could not be hidden forever, not in a house where drivers reported appointments, maids noticed untouched meals, and guards remembered which doctor's office a woman visited. But for now, the secret was hers, and while it was hers, she still had choices. Grace's words had stayed with her all night. I need every page of that contract. Not the copy they gave you, the original. The original was not in Clara's room. She knew that much. Vincent kept important papers in one of two places, the safe behind the panel in his private study, or the file room on the lower level, where business records were stored in locked cabinets and watched by cameras. Clara had never had a reason to care before. She had signed what her father put in front of her 2 years ago, hands cold, mouth dry. Her younger brother waiting in another room with no idea how close he had come to being pulled into Vincent De Luca's world. At the time, Clara told herself she was choosing sacrifice. Now she wondered if sacrifice was just the pretty word people used when a woman had no real choice. At 7:30 she dressed carefully. Not too formal, not too soft, a cream blouse, dark trousers, pearl earrings. Hair pinned low at the back of her neck. She looked like the wife Vincent expected to see at breakfast, polished, quiet, controlled. Nothing about her reflection suggested she had spent the night writing his cruelest words in a notebook. That was good. Let him see what he expected. At 8, she entered the dining room. Vincent was already there, as always. Seated at the head of the long table, with black coffee on his right, and a folder of reports open beside his plate. Morning light came through the tall windows, pale and cold. Two guards stood outside the French doors leading to the terrace. A maid poured Clara's tea and disappeared so quietly she might as well have been a shadow. Vincent looked up when Clara sat down. His gaze lingered a second longer than usual. Are you going to tell me what you meant yesterday? He asked. Clara unfolded her napkin and placed it across her lap. About what? His eyes narrowed slightly. You said you finally understood what this marriage was. I did. And she lifted her teacup, though the smell of it turned her stomach. And understanding a thing does to always require discussion. Vincent leaned back in his chair. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie yet. He looked calm. He always looked calm. That was one of the things people feared about him. Anger gave men away. Vincent rarely gave anything away. But Clara knew him better than he believed. Not as a wife loved by him. No, she had never been that. But as a woman who had spent 2 years studying the weather of his silence. This morning, there was tension in his right hand. 2 fingers tapped once against the folder, then stopped. He did not like not knowing what she meant. He did not like the feeling that something had shifted outside his permission. Did something happen? He asked. Clara met his eyes. Many things happen, Vincent, most of them you don't notice. The words were quiet, almost gentle, that made them worse. For the first time in a long while, he fully stopped what he was doing. Across the table, the air changed. Before he could answer, Frank Bellamy appeared at the dining room entrance. He was a tall man in his 50s with iron gray hair, a careful face, and the kind of loyalty that looked clean until you understood what it had cost other people. His eyes moved once to Clara, then back to Vincent. Car is ready, Frank said. Vincent did not look away from his wife. I'll be down in 5, Frank nodded and left. Clara placed her cup down. You going to the port? Vincent's expression did not change, but she saw the question pass through him. She did not usually ask about his schedule. Newark first, he said, then a meeting downtown, with the union men. This time, he did not hide his surprise quickly enough. Clara gave him a small, polite smile. You had them here last Thursday. One of them spilled coffee on the Persian rug in the blue sitting room and apologized, like a man who was more afraid of you than the stain. Vincent studied her. You remember that? I remember many things. Something flickered in his eyes. Not affection, not yet. More like recognition of an object he had owned for years and suddenly realized had sharp edges. Clara stood. Have a productive day. She walked out before he could dismiss her, and that alone was an act of rebellion. In the hallway, she kept her pace even. She did not hurry until she reached the east corridor, where the family rooms gave way to the quieter part of the house. There was a narrow sitting room there, rarely used, with a telephone line the staff kept for household calls. Clara slipped inside and closed the door. She called Grace. I need the original contract, Clara said. Grace did not ask if she was sure. That was one of the reasons Clara loved her. Grace had never treated her like a fragile thing simply because she was hurting. Where is it? Grace asked. Either Vincent's study or the file room downstairs. Can you access either one? The study, maybe. The file room, no. Then start with the study. But Clara, listen to me. Don't take anything obvious. Photograph pages if you can. If there's a safe, don't try to open it unless you know the code. Clara almost laughed. I'm not breaking into a safe in a mafia boss's study before lunch. Good. I like when my clients avoid felonies before noon. For one brief second, Clara felt something like normal life brush against her. A joke, a friend, a voice from outside the mansion as polished walls. Then Grace grew serious again. Has he noticed anything? Yes. How much? Enough to watch me. Not enough to understand why. That window won't stay open long. I know after the call. Clara returned to the main floor and took the long way through the house, moving as if she had no particular destination. She paused in the gallery, adjusted flowers in a vase, asked a maid whether the winter linens had been sent out, and waited until the front drive, filled with the sound of Vincent's convoy leaving. Only then did she go to the study. The room smelled like leather, smoke, and old money. Vincent's desk sat near the windows, large and dark, its surface clean except for a silver pen, a closed laptop, and a framed photograph of his father. Clara had always hated that photograph. The elder DeLuca had the face of a man who believed love was something women invented to make men weak. She walked behind the desk. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. Until she realized she was no longer searching as a frightened wife. She was searching as a mother. The top drawer held business cards, cufflinks, 2 passports, and a small black notebook filled with numbers she did not understand. The second drawer was locked. Clara did not force it. She moved instead to the bookshelves, then the side cabinet, then the narrow console beneath the portrait near the fireplace. Nothing, not the contract, not even a copy. She was closing the cabinet when a voice behind her said, "Looking for something." Clara turned. Luke DeLuca stood in the doorway wearing jeans, a wrinkled sweatshirt, and the expression of someone who had been born into a crime family but found most of it ridiculous. At 17, he already had Vincent's dark eyes, but none of Vincent's cold discipline. His hair was messy, his sneakers were untied, and he held an apple in one hand. Clara's pulse jumped, but her face did not change. "Yes," she said, "my patience." Luke looked at the open cabinet, then at her, then back at the cabinet. Did it fall behind the expensive liquor or under the secret murder files? Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. Luke stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Relax. I am not Frank." "No," Clara said, "you re louder, and better looking, that remains under review." He grinned. But the grin faded when he really looked at her. Luke had an uncomfortable habit of seeing what adults tried to hide. It made him difficult in a house where hiding things was practically a religion. "You read different," he said. Clara closed the cabinet. "Everyone keeps saying that. Maybe because it's true. Maybe everyone should stop watching me. In this house." Luke took a bite of the apple. "Good luck." Clara moved toward the door, but Luke stepped aside before she had to ask. That small courtesy nearly undid her more than Vincent's questions had. As she passed, he said, "He hurt you, didn't he?" Clara stopped. The study was quiet around them outside. A car rolled along the wet gravel drive. Somewhere in the walls, the old house settled with a low creak. She did not turn back. "People can hurt you without raising a hand," she said. For once, Luke had no joke ready. Clara left him standing in Vincent's study, with the apple forgotten in his hand that afternoon. She began learning the house properly. Not as a wife, as a woman planning for the day she might have to leave it. She learned which hallway cameras turned toward the stairs, and which ones had blind spots near the service entrance. She learned that Frank kept keys on a ring clipped inside his jacket, but the house manager kept duplicates in a locked drawer behind the pantry. She learned that Vincent's driver, Paul, reported everything, but noticed almost nothing unless it involved a car. She learned that the guards changed shifts at 6, but the kitchen staff changed at 5:30, creating 30 minutes of movement no one fully tracked. None of it looked like rebellion. That was the beauty of it. Clara walked through the mansion with a cup of ginger tea to calm her stomach, nodding to staff, asking polite questions, letting everyone believe she was simply restless. By evening, she had not found the contract, but she had found something almost as valuable. The DeLuca house was not impossible to understand. It was only designed to make women believe they should not try. That night, Vincent returned late. Clara heard his car before she saw the headlights sweep across the bedroom ceiling. She was sitting at her desk with a book open in front of her and her notebook hidden beneath it. A few minutes later, footsteps stopped outside her door. Vincent did not knock. He stood there long enough that Clara could feel him through the wood. Then he walked away. Only after his footsteps faded did Clara open the notebook. Below the words she had written the night before, she added a new line. "They underestimate what a quiet woman can learn." Then her phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "Any progress?" Clara looked toward the dark hallway. Then down at her stomach, she typed back, "Not yet, but I'm starting to understand the house." Grace replied almost immediately. "Good. Houses have secrets. Powerful men always forget that women are usually the ones who know where they rekept." Clara read the message twice. Then she closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and sat in the darkness with one hand over her unborn child. For the first time since she had heard Vincent say cruel words, she did not feel helpless. She felt afraid. She felt hurt. She felt terribly alone. But beneath all of that, something steadier had begun to rise. Vincent DeLuca wanted a son to protect his empire. He had no idea that the woman he had dismissed as temporary was already learning how to survive it. The DeLuca family dinner was not really a dinner. Clara had learned that during her first month as Vincent's wife. Food was served, wine was poured, silverware touched porcelain, and men laughed as if they were gathered for pleasure. But underneath it all, every dinner was a meeting. Every toast carried meaning. Every guest had been chosen for a reason, and every empty chair meant someone had fallen out of favor. That evening, the dining room had been prepared like a stage. Dark red roses filled the center of the table. Candles burned in heavy brass holders. The long windows reflected the room back at itself, making it seem as though twice as many men sat around the table, twice as many eyes watching, judging, measuring. Clara sat to Vincent's right, where a wife belonged in a family that cared deeply about appearances and very little about comfort. She wore a dark green dress with long sleeves and a high neckline. It was elegant enough to satisfy the room and loose enough to hide what no one knew yet. Her stomach was still flat. Her secret remained invisible. Still, she kept one hand in her lap for most of the evening. Fingers curled gently over the place where her child was growing. Vincent sat at the head of the table, quiet and controlled as always. He did not need to dominate the conversation. He simply allowed other men to speak until it suited him to stop them. Frank Bellamy sat 2 chairs down, watching everything with calm, careful eyes. Luke had been forced to attend, though he made his displeasure known by leaning back in his chair and answering every question with the fewest words possible. At first, the conversation stayed on safe topics: warehouses, city inspectors, a judge in Newark who had suddenly become less cooperative, a union man who wanted more money than he was worth. Clara listened without appearing to listen. That had become one of her most valuable skills inside the DeLuca house. Men spoke more freely around women they believed were decorative. Then an older capo named Arthur Quinn lifted his glass. "To the future," he said. The table quieted at once. Arthur was in his 70s, broad-shouldered, thick-necked, with the satisfied arrogance of a man who had survived long enough to mistake age for wisdom. He turned his smile toward Clara, and something in her stomach tightened. "To the future DeLuca, son," Arthur said. Several men laughed. A few lifted their glasses. One of them tapped the table in approval. Clara kept her face still. Arthur continued, enjoying himself. "It's time this family had a boy running around again. A real DeLuca boy. Someone to learn the ports from the ground up." Another man chuckled. "A daughter can marry out. A son holds the name." The words moved around the table like smoke. Familiar. Accepted. Poisonous because no one treated them as poison. Clara looked at Vincent. He was not laughing. For one brief, foolish second, she hoped he might stop it. He did not. He reached for his glass, took a slow drink, and said nothing. That silence told Clara more than any speech could have. Vincent did not need to repeat what she had heard outside the study. The room was saying it for him, and by refusing to correct them, he allowed the belief to stand. A son mattered. A daughter was something else. Something softer, something temporary. Something to protect until she became another man's concern. Clara felt her child beneath her hand, as if the baby could already hear the world waiting to measure its worth. Luke's chair scraped faintly against the floor. Everyone looked at him. He stared at Arthur with open dislike. "Funny. I thought ports were held by contracts, guns, and bribed officials. Didn't realize anatomy was part of the business plan." The room went cold. Arthur's smile vanished. Vincent's voice cut through the silence. "Luke, just one word, not loud, not angry, but sharp enough to make Luke sit back." Clara looked down at her plate. She did not want anyone to see what Luke's defiance had done to her. It was not enough to save her, not enough to change the room. But it was something. A small crack in a wall she had thought was solid stone. Dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Men became more careful. Vincent spoke briefly about shipping schedules, then about a warehouse expansion near the waterfront. Clara answered when spoken to, smiled when required, and memorized everything. After dessert, she excused herself before coffee. No one stopped her. Women were allowed to leave rooms once the real conversations began. That, Clara was learning, was one of the great mistakes men made. They believed exclusion was power. They never considered what a woman might hear on her way out. She had barely reached the east hallway when Rose DeLuca appeared beside her. Rose moved quietly for a woman her age. She wore black, as she almost always did, with a strand of pearls at her throat and her gray hair pinned into a severe knot. In the DeLuca family, Rose was treated with respect but not warmth. Clara had once thought the older woman cold. Now she wondered if coldness was what remained after a lifetime of swallowing fire. "You handled that well," Rose said. Clara looked ahead. "I did nothing. Sometimes doing nothing at a table full of men is the only way to leave with your dignity intact." Clara stopped near the window. Rain had started again, soft against the glass. Rose stood beside her, watching the dark lawn beyond the house. Men in this family talk about sons when they are afraid of being forgotten. Clara's throat tightened, and daughters. Rose turned her head slowly. Her eyes were pale blue and unreadable. Daughters remember what sons are trained to deny. The words settled between them. Clara did not speak. She was afraid if she did, too much would come out. Rose's gaze dropped, just for a second, to Clara's hand resting over her stomach. It was not dramatic. Not obvious, but Clara saw it. Rose knew, or at least suspected. The older woman said quietly, "If it is a girl, do not let this house teach her." She arrived as an apology. Clara looked at her then. For the first time since entering the DeLuca family, she felt as though someone had spoken not to Vincent's wife, not to an ornament, not to a debt repaid, but to the woman standing underneath all of that. Before Clara could answer, Rose walked away. Later that night, Vincent did not come to their bedroom. Clara knew because she remained awake long past midnight. Listening, his absence should have brought relief. Instead, it gave her room to think. She rose, wrapped a robe around herself, and walked down the quiet hall. She did not know why she went toward the west wing. Maybe because Rose's words had opened a door inside her. Maybe because the dinner had made one thing clear. Vincent's cruelty had roots. And if Clara was going to survive this family, she needed to understand the soil it had grown from. The door to Vincent's father's room was partly open. Clara had passed it many times but never entered. Tonight she stepped inside. The room smelled of dust, leather, and old cigar smoke trapped in wood. Portraits lined the walls, DeLuca men in dark suits, DeLuca men with hard mouths, DeLuca men staring down from gold frames as if the house still belonged to them. There were no women, not one, no mother, no daughters, no wives, no one who had carried the children, hosted the dinners, buried the secrets, or paid the quiet price of keeping the family alive. Clara stood in the center of the room and understood something with sudden, painful clarity. Vincent had not invented the sentence he said in the study. He had inherited it. That did not make it less cruel. It did not make him innocent. But it told Clara what she was truly fighting. Not one man's disappointment. A whole family's belief system. A history that erased women and called it tradition. On the desk sat a silver-framed photograph of Vincent as a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing beside his father, even then. His face had been too serious for a child. His father's hand rested heavily on his shoulder. Not affectionate, but possessive. Clara stared at the photo for a long time, then she whispered, "You were taught this." Her hand moved to her stomach. "But my child wanted to be." She left the room and returned to her own, with a new kind of steadiness in her chest. The next morning, Vincent received a call before breakfast. Clara was in the hallway when Frank approached him near the study door. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough. "Grace Miller," Frank said, "Philadelphia family attorney. Mrs. DeLuca sent her a scan of the marriage agreement." Vincent went still. Frank lowered his voice. "Do you want me to find out why?" Vincent looked down the hall. For one brief second, his eyes met Clara's. And Clara knew the quiet part of her war was over. Vincent did not confront Clara in the hallway. That was not his way. A lesser's man might have demanded answers the moment Frank said Grace Miller's name. A louder man might have grabbed Clara by the arm, dragged her into the study, and asked why his wife was sending marriage documents to a lawyer in Philadelphia. Vincent DeLuca did none of that. He looked at Clara from the end of the hall, with those dark, unreadable eyes, held her gaze for 1 second too long, and then turned away as if nothing had happened. That frightened her more than anger would have. Anger was simple. Anger burned hot and wasted itself quickly. Vincent's silence was different. It was patient. It had rooms inside it, all day. Clara felt the house shift around her. No one said anything. No one stopped her. No guard blocked a hallway. No maid looked directly at her. But she could feel the attention tightening like a net. A man she did not recognize stood near the back terrace for 2 hours pretending to check his phone. Paul, Vincent's driver. asked twice if she had plans to leave the house. Even the kitchen staff seemed quieter than usual. By afternoon, Clara understood what was happening. Vincent was not accusing her yet, he was watching, and because he was watching, she became careful in the way only a frightened woman can become careful. She did not call Grace from the house phone. She did not leave her notebook where anyone might find it. She moved through the rooms with the same calm expression she had worn for 2 years. But inside, every step had a purpose. That evening, Vincent came to their bedroom before dinner. Clara was standing at the mirror, removing a pair of pearl earrings. She saw him in the reflection before she heard him. He had taken off his suit jacket, but still wore his dress shirt. Sleeves rolled once at the wrists. He looked like a husband returning home after a long day. He was not. "Why did you send our marriage agreement to Grace Miller?" he asked. Clara continued removing the earring. Her fingers did not shake. She was proud of that. "Because I wanted to understand what I signed. You signed it 2 years ago." She placed the earring in the small porcelain dish on her vanity. "No. My father signed most of it. I was simply delivered with the debt." Vincent's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A small tightening around the mouth, a stillness in the shoulders. "You were not delivered." Clara turned then. "Wasn't I?" The room seemed to shrink around them. Outside, the last of the evening light faded against the windows. Clara could smell his cologne. Clean and expensive, and beneath it the faint trace of cigar smoke from wherever he had spent the afternoon. Vincent took one step closer. "If you had questions about the agreement, you could have asked me." That almost made her laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. "Could I?" she asked. "Could I have sat across from you at breakfast and asked whether my rights as your wife ended the moment I became useful as a mother?" His jaw hardened. "Choose your words carefully." "I have been choosing them carefully for 2 years." Vincent stared at her, for a moment. Clara thought he might finally ask the question that mattered. Not what had she sent, not who had she called, not what did Grace know, but why? Why had his wife become afraid enough to seek legal advice in secret? Instead, he asked, "Are you planning to leave me?" There it was, not concern, not remorse, possession. Clara looked at him and felt something inside her settle into place. "Would that bother you as a husband?" she asked, "or inconvenience you as a boss?" The silence that followed was colder than any answer. Vincent did not touch her. He did not threaten her. He did not raise his voice. In some ways, that made it worse. He simply looked at her as if she had become a problem he had not yet decided how to solve. Then he turned and left the room. Clara waited until the door closed before she allowed herself to breathe. Downstairs, Vincent found Frank waiting near the study. "Find out what Miller knows," Vincent said. Frank nodded. "Do you want pressure applied?" Vincent's answer came too fast. "No." Frank studied him, but wisely said nothing. Vincent looked toward the staircase. "No contact, no threats. I want her watched, not frightened." But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew they were dishonest. He told himself he was protecting the family. He told himself an outside lawyer created risk. He told himself Clara was emotional, inexperienced, and possibly being manipulated. But the truth sat beneath all of that like a stone. He was afraid she had started building an exit. And more than that, he was afraid she might not look back when she reached it. The next morning, Clara left the mansion with Paul driving. She told the household she was going to a charity committee meeting in Philadelphia. That was the first direct lie she had ever told inside the DeLuca house. It tasted bitter on her tongue, but not as bitter as the truth would have. The women's clinic was quiet, discreet, and expensive enough to promise privacy. Clara sat in the waiting room, with a magazine open on her lap, and did not read a single word. Every woman around her seemed to belong to another world. A young couple whispering over ultrasound pictures. A mother with a toddler asleep against her shoulder. A woman in a blue sweater smiling at her phone. Clara wondered how many of them had told the father already. How many had been held. How many had been afraid. When the doctor called her back, Clara followed with her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The appointment was routine at first. Blood pressure, questions, vitamins, warnings about stress. Then came the early screening results. The doctor spoke gently. "It's still early, and we'll confirm more later. But based on the testing, there is a strong indication the baby is female. Female, a girl. The word filled the room. For a moment, Clara could not answer. A daughter. She should have felt joy first. Maybe she did, somewhere beneath the fear. But fear rose faster. Sharper, crueler. She saw the dining room, Arthur Quinn lifting his glass, men laughing about a future son. Vincent silent at the head of the table. Vincent in the study, saying they would try again. Mrs. DeLuca, the doctor asked softly. Clara blinked. I'm fine. It was the second lie, later, in the parking lot. She sat behind the tinted windows of Vincent's car, while Paul waited outside near the curb, pretending not to look back. Clara held the ultrasound photo in both hands. There was almost nothing to see yet. Just a small, blurred shape. A beginning. Her daughter. The tears came then, quietly at first, then harder. She pressed one hand over her mouth, because she had learned long ago that pain was safer when no one heard it. But when she touched her stomach, her breathing steadied. You are not less, she whispered. Not to me, never to me, outside the car. Paul glanced once in the side mirror. He saw Clara wiping her face. He saw the clinic sign. He saw enough. By the time Clara returned to the mansion, the call had already been made. Vincent was waiting in the front sitting room, standing beside the window with one hand in his pocket and the other holding a glass he had not touched. When Clara stepped inside, the air changed. He looked at her coat, her face, her hands, then he asked, very quietly, "Were you going to tell me?" Clara stood in the doorway, one hand resting over the child he had not wanted unless she was a son, and for the first time, she understood that the next lie would cost too much. No, she said. Not after what I heard. No, Clara said. Not after what I heard. For a moment, Vincent did not move. The front sitting room seemed to hold its breath around them. Firelight flickered in the marble fireplace, throwing gold over the dark furniture. The polished floor, the glass in Vincent's untouched drink. Outside, the estate was quiet beneath a low gray sky, but inside the room, every silent thing felt like a witness. Vincent's eyes stayed on Clara's face. What did you hear? Clara almost laughed. It would have been easier if he had denied it immediately. Easier if he had looked guilty. Easier if he had become angry. Because anger would have given her something solid to push against. But Vincent only stood there, still and controlled, as if the right question might save him from the wrong answer. Clara stepped fully into the room and removed her gloves one finger at a time. She laid them on the small table beside the doorway. It was strange. The things a person noticed when a life was breaking open. The soft leather of the gloves. The smell of smoke from the fireplace. The way Vincent's glass caught the light. Though he had not taken a single sip. I heard you in your study, she said. Something changed in his face. Not enough for another person to notice. But Clara noticed. She had spent 2 years noticing the things Vincent thought he hid well. When? He asked. The night I came home from the clinic. His jaw tightened. Clara, no. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. You don't get to speak first. The words surprised both of them. Vincent was not used to being interrupted in his own house. Men twice Clara's size had died because they did not know when to stop talking. But she was no longer afraid of his silence, and that made her dangerous in a way he had never prepared for. She walked toward him slowly. Not close enough for him to touch her, but close enough that he could see she was not shaking. I heard every word, she said. Not part of it. Not enough to misunderstand. Every word. Vincent looked away for the first time. That was how Clara knew he remembered. She gave him his own sentence back. I'll tolerate her until she gives me a son. The room went cold. Vincent's hand tightened around the glass. Clara continued, each word clear, each one measured, each one pulled from the place where she had been carrying it like broken glass. After that, she can live wherever she wants. His eyes closed briefly. The child stays with me. When she said the last sentence, Vincent set the glass down before it could break in his hand. Those words were not meant for you. No, Clara said. They were only about me. That makes them much better. His mouth hardened. You heard a conversation about family strategy. I heard my husband discuss me like a temporary inconvenience. You do not understand the pressure I am under. For the first time, something hot moved through her grief. There it is, she said. Pressure, duty, strategy. All the polished words men use when they want cruelty to sound respectable. Vincent took a breath through his nose. This family is not normal. You know that. Yes, Clara said. I do. That is why I called a lawyer before I told you I was pregnant. His eyes snapped back to hers. You called Grace before telling me. I called Grace because I needed to know whether my child and I were safe. The words struck him. She could see it. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were plain. There was no insult in them, no exaggeration. Just a truth he could not easily move around. Vincent's voice lowered. You are safe in this house. Clara looked at him for a long time. Am I? He looked almost offended. No one would touch you. You still think safety means no one lays a hand on me. Her voice softened, and somehow that made it worse. Vincent, I have been lonely in rooms full of your men. I have been spoken over, watched, managed, and displayed. I have sat at your table while men toasted a son who does not exist and laughed about daughters like they were failed attempts. And you said nothing. His eyes darkened. I did not agree with them. You did not have to. You let the room believe they were right. He had no answer for that. Before he could find one. Clara's phone vibrated in her coat pocket. She ignored it. It vibrated again. Then a third time. Vincent noticed. Answer it, he said. She almost refused, simply because he had told her to. But then she saw Grace's name on the screen. Clara turned slightly away from Vincent and answered. Grace. Grace did not greet her. Her voice was sharp, controlled, and full of warning. Are you alone? Clara looked at Vincent. No. A short silence passed through the line. Is he with you? Yes. Then listen carefully and do not react too fast, Grace said. I found the clause. Clara's hand tightened around the phone. What clause? Vincent watched her closely. Grace exhaled. The custody clause. It's buried in the family security section, not the marital section. That's why I missed it the first time. The room tilted, though Clara did not move. Grace continued, slower now. If a child is born of the marriage, and you are later deemed mentally unstable, medically unfit, a security risk, or a threat to the DeLuca household, Vincent can petition for primary custody under the terms your father accepted. Clara closed her eyes. For 1 second, she was not in the sitting room anymore. She was back in her father's office 2 years ago, watching him avoid her eyes while he told her this marriage would save her brother. She remembered the pen in her hand, the thick stack of paper. The way her father had said, it's just formal language. Clara, these people are careful. Careful, yes, they had been very careful. Grace's voice softened. Clara, this does not mean he will use it, but it means someone made sure he could. Clara opened her eyes and looked at Vincent. He had gone very still. Did you know? She asked him. Vincent did not answer fast enough. That was the problem. The delay was only a second, maybe less. But Clara had learned that sometimes the truth lived inside the pause before a powerful man found his sentence. Did you know? She repeated. Vincent's voice was quiet. I knew there were provisions for family security. Clara laughed once, softly, without humor. Family security. Your father's lawyers agreed to the terms. My father sold me to cover his debt. I wouldn't use him as a moral witness if I were you. Grace said her name through the phone, but Clara barely heard it. Her whole body felt cold, not from fear now, from understanding. The words in the study had not been just ugly, they had been possible. That was what made them monstrous. Vincent had not simply said the child would stay with him. The contract had already built a road for that to happen. Clara lowered the phone, but did not end the call. Vincent stepped toward her. Clara, you would never what? She asked. Use the clause, take the child. Decide I was unstable if I tried to leave. Have a doctor write what your lawyers needed. Have a judge you own call it protection. His face hardened. You think that little of me. I heard what you think of me. The sentence landed between them. Brutal because it was fair. Vincent's voice dropped. You are my wife, no, Clara said. I am the woman you said you would tolerate. The silence afterward was so complete that even the fire seemed quieter. Then Clara placed one hand over her stomach. And you should know something else. Vincent looked down at her hand. For the first time since she entered the room, his control slipped. Not completely. Vincent DeLuca did not fall apart in front of people. But something in him shifted, and Clara saw the man beneath the boss for half a second. A man who understood he was standing at the edge of something he might not be able to repair. The baby, Clara said. Maybe a girl. Vincent did not speak. It was not a long silence. 3 seconds, maybe 4, but Clara felt each one like a door closing. His eyes moved from her stomach to her face, and whatever he meant, whatever he felt, whatever confusion or fear or old family poison passed through him, he said nothing fast enough to save the moment. Clara nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now I know what I need to protect her from." That finally broke something in his expression. "Clara." But she was already walking away. Grace was still on the phone. Clara lifted it back to her ear as she reached the staircase. "I need options," she said. Grace's voice was steady now. "Fierce in the way loyalty could be fierce. Then we make them." Behind Clara, Vincent stood alone in the front sitting room, surrounded by firelight, family portraits, and the echo of his own words. For the first time in his life, the DeLuca house did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a trial. That night, Clara moved into the east bedroom. She did not ask permission. She did not announce it. She simply packed 2 suitcases, carried her medical envelope, her notebook, and the ultrasound photograph down the hall, and closed the door behind her. Then she locked it. Vincent came 20 minutes later. She knew his footsteps. Everyone in that house knew them, measured, calm, certain. They stopped outside her door. For a long time, he said nothing. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, with one hand over her stomach, and the other holding the notebook open on her lap. On the first page were his words: "I tolerate her until she gives me a son. The child stays with me." Below them, she had written her own promise: "He will not decide what my child is worth." Outside the door, Vincent finally raised his hand. She could see the shadow move beneath the crack of light, but he did not knock. Maybe he did not know what to say, maybe, for the first time. He understood that words had consequences long after the mouth was finished with them. After a while, his footsteps moved away. Clara waited until the hall was silent. Then she opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote one new sentence: "A daughter is not a disappointment." She looked down at her stomach, her voice barely more than breath. "If you are a girl," she whispered, "you will never have to earn your right to be loved." And in the east bedroom of a mansion built on sons, Clara DeLuca made her second decision as a mother. She would not let her child inherit the wound that had broken every woman before her. By the next morning, everyone in the DeLuca mansion knew something had changed. No one said it out loud. In that house, silence was the first language people learned, and survival was the second. The maids still moved through the halls with silver trays. The guards still changed shifts at 6. Frank Bellamy still entered Vincent's study at 8:30, with a folder tucked beneath one arm. Breakfast was still served in the dining room, with white roses in the center of the table, and coffee poured exactly the way Vincent liked it. But Clara did not come downstairs. That was the first sign. The second came when Vincent sat at the head of the table and did not ask where she was. He knew. Everyone knew. Clara had moved into the east bedroom, the room that was usually reserved for important guests who never stayed long enough to leave anything behind. By sunrise, it no longer looked like a guest room. Her books were stacked on the small writing desk. Her robe hung behind the bathroom door. Her medical envelope was hidden in the bottom drawer beneath folded scarves. The ultrasound photograph sat inside her notebook. Between the page where she had written Vincent's cruel words and the page where she had promised her child would not inherit them. She had not slept much, but she had slept better behind a locked door. That realization hurt more than she expected. A wife should not sleep better because her husband is on the other side of the house. At 9, a maid named Helen knocked softly and asked if Mrs. DeLuca wanted breakfast sent up. Clara almost said no. Her stomach was unsettled, and food had become difficult since the pregnancy began. But then she thought of the small life inside her and forced herself to answer like a woman making a choice, not a woman hiding from pain. "Yes," she said, "toast, eggs, and ginger tea." Helen paused, perhaps surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Of course, ma'am." When the tray arrived, Clara thanked her. Not the automatic kind of thank you rich women gave staff because manners were expected. A real one. Helen looked at her for a second longer than usual, then lowered her eyes and left. Clara ate slowly by the window, looking out over the Winterbear Gardens. In the distance, beyond the stone wall, 2 guards stood near the back gate. One of them kept glancing toward the east wing. She was being watched. Of course she was. The difference was that now she watched back, downstairs. Vincent had not touched his breakfast. Frank noticed, though he was wise enough not to mention it. The boss sat with one hand around his coffee cup and his eyes on the empty chair to his right, Clara's chair, for 2 years. She had sat there like part of the room, quiet, polished, present when needed, invisible when not. Vincent had told himself she preferred silence, that she understood the arrangement, that comfort, security, and his name were more than most women in her position could expect. Now the empty chair made all those thoughts feel cheap. Luke came in late, wearing a black hoodie and an expression already sharpened for conflict. He dropped into his seat without greeting anyone. Vincent looked at him. "You late." Luke reached for toast, still showed up. "That S more than some people deserve." Frank went still. Vincent's eyes narrowed. "Careful." Luke gave a short laugh. "That's the family motto, isn't it? Be careful. Don't speak too loud. Don't embarrass the men who run everything badly." Vincent set his cup down. "If you have something to say, say it." Luke looked at the empty chair beside him, then back at his brother. "You wanted a son so badly you forgot to become a father first." The room froze. Even Frank's face changed. Vincent did not move for a moment, then he stood. "Come with me." Luke leaned back. "Why?" "So you can explain legacy to me. Bloodline. Duty. All the other old man garbage Arthur and his friends drink to, while Clara sits there pretending not to bleed." Vincent's voice dropped. "Get up." Luke stood so fast, his chair scraped the floor. He followed Vincent out of the dining room and down the corridor to the training room, where heavy bags hung from the ceiling, and the walls smelled faintly of leather, sweat, and gun oil. It was one of the few rooms in the house where Vincent allowed anger to exist, though even there he kept it disciplined. The door closed behind them. Vincent turned. "You do not speak about my wife in front of my men." Luke laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your wife, that's rich." Vincent took a step toward him. "You a child, I am 17. Old enough to know when a woman moves across the house, because her husband made her feel safer behind a lock." Vincent's hand flexed at his side. "You don't know what you talking about." "I live here," Luke said. "I know more than you think. Everyone knows more than you think. You just mistake fear for respect, so nobody bothers telling you the truth." Vincent's face hardened. "Enough." "No," Luke snapped. "Not enough. You talk about legacy, like it's blood. Maybe legacy is just the damage men refuse to stop passing down." The slap came before Vincent thought. It was not hard enough to knock Luke down. It was not the kind of violence that left blood. But the sound cracked through the room, like something breaking in the bones of the house. Luke turned his face slowly back to Vincent. For one awful second, neither of them breathed. Then Luke smiled, small and bitter. "There he is." Vincent looked at his hand. The anger drained out of him so quickly, it left something worse behind. Recognition. He had seen that hand before. Not his own, but his father's, heavy on a shoulder, sharp across a face. Raised not because a lesson needed teaching, but because a man had been challenged and did not know how to bear the shame. Luke stepped back. Eyes shining with fury he refused to let become tears. "Congratulations. You exactly what you swore you weren't." He left the room. Vincent stayed there alone, staring at the red mark forming across his younger brother's cheek in his memory. Later that afternoon, Rose came to him. She did not knock before entering his study. She had earned that right by outliving too many DeLuca men who believed they were permanent. Vincent was standing near the window, his tie loosened, his untouched lunch on the desk behind him. Rose closed the door. "You hit him," she said. Vincent did not turn. "He told you." "He didn't have to. This house speaks even when all of you pretend it does." Vincent closed his eyes. "I lost control." "No," Rose said. "You found the control you were raised with." That made him turn. Rose looked older than usual that day. Not weak. Never weak, but tired in a way that seemed to come from decades rather than hours. She walked to the chair across from his desk, but did not sit. "You think this began with Clara," she said. "It did not." Vincent said nothing. Rose's fingers tightened around the handle of her cane. "Your mother was warned not to carry another child." The room went very still. Vincent's voice was flat. "What?" "The doctors told your father another pregnancy could kill her." She had already given him 3 daughters. 3 healthy girls he treated like unfinished attempts. Rose's mouth trembled once before she steadied it. He wanted a son, needed one, he said. The family name, the business, the future. All those grand words men use when they are about to ask a woman to pay with her body. Vincent stared at her. No, he said, yes. She died from complications. She died because he forced her to risk her life for a son. The words did not explode, they sank. That was worse. Vincent sat down slowly, not because he chose to, but because his body seemed to forget how to stand. His mother had been a portrait to him, a perfume bottle left on a dresser. A few stories softened by time. He had been told she was delicate, brave, proud to give the family its son. He had built his guilt around a lie. He had spent his life believing his birth killed her. Now Rose was telling him it was not his birth. It was his father's hunger. Rose's voice softened, but not enough to spare him. Your mother did not die because of you, Vincent. She died because your father loved the idea of a son more than the woman carrying him. Vincent lowered his head. For years he had hated his father, quietly, privately, in ways no one could use against him. He had told himself he was different because he did not hit women, because he did not shout, because Clara had beautiful rooms, guards, money, doctors, anything she could ask for. But what good was a beautiful room if a woman felt safer locking herself inside it? What have I done? He asked. Rose did not answer quickly. Then she said, the same thing men in this family always do. You treated a woman's silence like consent. That night, Vincent went to the east wing. The hallway outside Clara's room was dim and quiet. He stood before her door, one hand at his side, the other curled into a fist he had no right to use. Light glowed beneath the door. He could hear her voice inside, soft but clear. She was on the phone. I don't need him to love me, Clara said. I need him to not own me. Vincent closed his eyes. Grace's voice was too faint for him to hear, but Clara's answer came after a pause. I don't know if I am leaving yet. I only know I want to raise my child to beg for respect in the same house where I had to. The words entered him more cleanly than any bullet could have. He lifted his hand to knock, then stopped. What would he say? I am sorry. He was sorry. For the words, for the silence, for the clause he had not cared enough to question, for the empty chair at breakfast, for Luke's cheek, for his mother, for Clara standing outside his study with their child inside her while he turned her into a function. But sorry was too small. Sorries was what men said when they wanted the injured person to carry the burden of forgiving them. Vincent lowered his hand. For the first time in his life, he understood that restraint could be more than control. It could be respect. He turned and walked away. Inside the room, Clara sat on the bed with the phone against her ear, long after the line had gone quiet. She had heard the floorboards outside. She knew Vincent had been there, and she knew he had left. She did not know whether that meant cowardice or restraint. Maybe both. She touched her stomach, feeling nothing yet but believing anyway. You hear that? She whispered. That was the sound of a man learning the door does to open just because he wants it to. Down the hall, Rose stood in the shadows and watched Vincent disappear toward the west wing. For the first time in many years, the old woman allowed herself to hope. Not because the DeLuca house was healed. It was not. A house built on generations of silence does not become safe in one night. But somewhere inside it, the silence had cracked. And through that crack, the truth had finally begun to breathe. Elias Moretti heard about the trouble inside the DeLuca house before Vincent was willing to admit there was trouble at all. That was how men like Moretti survived. They did not wait for an enemy to fall. They listened for the first crack in the floorboards and stepped exactly where the wood was weakest. By the end of the week, 3 separate whispers had reached him in Chicago. Clara DeLuca was pregnant. She and Vincent were sleeping in separate rooms. A Philadelphia lawyer had begun asking quiet questions about a marriage contract that should have stayed buried in a locked file. To most people, those were household problems. To Elias Moretti, they were an open door. He sat in the back room of a private club that looked respectable from the street and rotten everywhere else. The walls were paneled in dark wood. The bourbon was expensive. The men who came there were the kind who smiled in newspaper photographs and paid other men to do the things that kept their hands clean. Across from him sat a nervous man in a gray coat. His name was Peter Voss. one of the junior security men who worked the night rotation at the DeLuca estate. He had gambling debts, a sick mother, and the tragic stupidity of believing no one would notice if he sold small pieces of information to a larger predator. Moretti listened without interrupting. The wife moved to the east room. Peter said, "Boss hasn't forced the door, hasn't even raised his voice. Far as I know." Moretti smiled faintly. "That may be worse." Peter swallowed. "Worse. A man like Vincent DeLuca does not fear arguments. He fears distance." Moretti turned his glass slowly on the table. "What else?" "She has been talking to that lawyer. Grace Miller, Family Law, Philadelphia. Boss had her watched, but no contact. And the pregnancy." Peter hesitated. Moretti's smile disappeared. Peter lowered his voice. "Clinic says it might be a girl." For a moment, Moretti said nothing. Then he leaned back, almost amused. "A daughter," he said softly. "Poor Vincent." The words were not pity. They were strategy forming in real time. By the next morning, an envelope arrived at the DeLuca estate addressed to Clara in neat black handwriting. No return address, no stamp. Someone had placed it directly into the household mail. Helen brought it to the east bedroom with Clara's breakfast tray. Clara recognized danger before she opened it, not because the envelope looked threatening, because it looked too clean, too deliberate. In the DeLuca world, cruelty often arrived polished. Inside were 3 photographs. The first showed Grace Miller leaving her office in Philadelphia, one hand holding a coffee, the other carrying a leather briefcase. The second showed Clara herself entering the Women's Clinic 3 days earlier. The third showed the side entrance of the DeLuca mansion, circled in red ink. Beneath the photographs was a note: "If you want your child born outside his cage, come alone. The Harborview Hotel. Room 614. Tonight at 9. Clara read the note twice. Her first feeling was fear. She would not lie to herself about that. Fear rose fast and sharp, turning her fingers cold. Whoever had sent this knew about the baby, knew about Grace, knew about the house. Knew enough to reach through every wall Vincent had built and touch the one place Clara could not leave unprotected, but fear did not stay alone. Behind it came anger. Not loud, not reckless, precise. Moretti, because it had to be Moretti, thought he understood her. He thought a frightened, pregnant woman would grab any hand extended toward her, even if that hand belonged to another monster. He thought Vincent's cruelty had made her desperate enough to mistake a trap for a rescue. Clara placed the photographs on the desk and called Grace from the burner phone they had agreed to use. Grace answered immediately. "Tell me you re somewhere private, I received a message." Clara read it aloud. Grace cursed under her breath. "Do not go. If I don't he moves on you. Clara, if I go stupidly he owns me, so I want to go stupidly." There was a pause, then Grace's voice changed. It became the voice she used in court, calm because panic had no legal value. "Listen carefully. Do you still have the recorder I gave you?" "Yes." "Take it. Keep your phone on. Location sharing active, but not with Vincent. Send it to Luke." Clara looked toward the closed door. "Luke. He sees more than Vincent does right now." Clara knew that was true. Before sunset, she found Luke in the greenhouse, where he had been hiding from the mood of the house and pretending not to care about anything. She handed him a small silver cufflink sealed inside a tissue. He frowned. "What is this?" "Something I took from one of Moretti's men at dinner 2 weeks ago." "Why are you giving it to me?" "Because if I am not back by midnight, you need to show it to your brother." Luca's face lost all humor. "Clara, what are you doing?" "Thinking," she said. "That is more than most people expect from me." He stepped closer. "Does Vincent know?" "No." "Why not?" "Because someone inside this house is talking to Moretti. Until I know who, I can trust the walls." Luke looked suddenly younger than 17. "Then trust me." Clara's expression softened. "That's what I am doing, at 9 o'clock. Clara entered the Harborview Hotel through a side door beneath a flickering green sign. The place smelled of old carpet, cigarette smoke, and rainwater tracked in from the street. She wore a dark coat, flat shoes, and no jewelry except her wedding ring. In her pocket, Grace's recorder was already running. Room 614 waited at the end of a narrow hallway. Clara stood outside the door for one breath, one heartbeat, one silent promise to the child beneath her hand. Then she knocked inside. Elias Moretti smiled, and across town, Luke DeLuca stared at the cufflink in his palm. finally understanding that Clara had just walked into a trap on purpose. Elias Moretti did not look like a man waiting to threaten a pregnant woman. That was the first thing Clara noticed when she stepped into room 614. He was not pacing, he was not angry. He did not have a gun on the table or blood on his cuffs. He sat near the window in a navy suit, one ankle resting over his knee, a glass of untouched whiskey beside him, as if this were a business appointment and not a trap. The hotel room smelled faintly of old smoke and expensive cologne trying to cover it. Rain streaked the window behind him, blurring the lights from the harbor into long trembling lines. Moretti smiled when he saw her. "Mrs. DeLuca," he said, "you came alone." Clara closed the door behind her. "That was the instruction, and you follow instructions well. Only when I want to know who gave them." His smile widened. "Vincent chose an interesting wife." "No," Clara said. "Vincent chose a convenient one. There's a difference." Moretti studied her for a moment, and Clara let him. Men like him always wanted to believe they were the first to truly see a woman. It made them careless. It made them talk. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit down." Clara remained standing. "I'm pregnant, not obedient." Something amused flickered across his face. "I can see why you becoming a problem for him." In her coat pocket, the recorder kept running. Clara felt its small weight against her palm and let that steady her. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. Only foolish people felt no fear when they walked into a room with a man who had already proven he could reach their friends, their doctors, their home. But fear did not have to make her stupid. Fear could sharpen a woman if she refused to let it swallow her. Moretti leaned forward. "I know what he said to you." Clara said nothing. "I know about the son. I know about the separate rooms. I know about Grace Miller. And I know that child you recarrying may not be the heir Vincent wanted." The word heir made her stomach twist. "My child is not your negotiation tool," she said. "No," Moretti said softly. "But you are his." Clara let the words sit between them. He expected them to hurt. They did, but pain was not new to her anymore. Vincent had given her the wound. Moretti was only pressing on it. He continued. "You think Vincent will change because he feels guilty tonight. Men like him don't change, Clara. They adapt. If the baby is a girl, he'll smile for the cameras, buy little dresses, let the family pretend. But sooner or later, the pressure returns. A son, a name, a future." Clara looked toward the rain-smeared window. "And you offering me freedom." "I am offering you a door. Doors don't usually come with threats against my lawyer." Moretti's eyes sharpened slightly. "There. A small irritation, a small opening. I had to make sure you understood the stakes." "No," Clara said. "You had to make sure I was scared enough to trust the wrong man." For the first time, his smile thinned. She took one step closer. "Who inside the house told you I was pregnant?" Moretti leaned back again, trying to recover his ease. "Does it matter? It matters to me. You should be more concerned with what I can do for you. I am concerned with what you've already done." He laughed quietly. "You sound like a lawyer." "I've been speaking to one." "That lawyer is the only reason you're still thinking small. Custody, contracts, protection orders, paper shields." His voice lowered. "Vincent's world does not respect paper unless someone dangerous is standing behind it, and you read dangerous." "I'm impractical." "No, you read desperate." That landed. Moretti's face cooled. "Careful." Clara almost smiled. "There it is. Every man says that when a woman gets too close to the truth." He stood then, slowly, not rushing, not threatening in any obvious way. But the room changed with his height, his closeness, his confidence. "You want truth?" he asked. "Fine. I have a man inside Vincent's security team. I know when the guards change. I know which clinic you use. I know Grace Miller leaves her office late on Thursdays. And if Vincent refuses my offer on the port route, I can take you after the birth, before he even knows which car you in." Clara's heartbeat hammered so hard she felt it in her throat, but her face stayed calm. Moretti stepped closer. "So yes, Clara, I can help you disappear. Or I can make you disappear. The choice depends on whether you give me what I need." She looked at him for one long second. Then she said, "You thought pain would make me careless." His brows drew together. Clara reached into her pocket and took out the recorder. "It made me precise." The door behind her opened before Moretti could move. Vincent entered first, with Luke just behind him, and two men in dark coats remaining in the hallway. But Vincent did not storm in, he did not shout. He did not grab Clara or order her behind him. He simply looked at her, then at the recorder in her hand, and understood exactly what she had done. Moretti recovered quickly. You let your wife fight your war. Vincent's eyes never left Clara's face. No, he said quietly. I finally stopped standing in her way. Moretti's expression hardened, but the power in the room had already shifted. Not because Vincent had arrived with men, because Clara had arrived with evidence. On the ride back, the car was silent for a long time. Rain tapped against the roof. Luke sat in the front seat, pretending not to listen. Vincent sat beside Clara but did not touch her. Finally, he said, I'm sorry. Clara looked out the window. For which part? Vincent's answer came slowly. For making you believe the safest thing you could do was hide our child from me. Clara closed her eyes. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But for the first time in weeks, she did not turn away. The next morning, Vincent asked Clara to come with him to the West Wing. He did not order her. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood outside the east bedroom after breakfast, one hand at his side, the other resting loosely against the doorframe, and said, There is something I want to show you, if you are willing. Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering. The apology in the car still lived between them, unfinished and fragile. It had been the right thing to say, but Clara had learned that the right words could still be too small for the damage done. Still, she followed him. He led her through the long corridor past rooms she rarely entered, then stopped before the DeLuca family gallery. Clara had been in that room only twice before. Both times, she had felt like an intruder standing side a museum built by men for men. The walls were covered with portraits of DeLuca fathers, DeLuca sons, DeLuca bosses, DeLuca heirs, dark suits, hard eyes, heavy frames. Generations of men staring down as if the house still belonged to them. There were no mothers on the walls, no daughters, no wives. No women who had carried the children, buried the secrets, hosted the dinners, forgiven the sins, and disappeared before anyone thought to paint them. Vincent stopped in front of the largest portrait. His father. The man Clara had only seen in photographs, but whose shadow seemed to live in every room of the mansion. For a moment, Vincent did not speak. Then he reached up, unhooked the portrait, and lifted it down from the wall. Clara watched him carry it to the floor. What are you doing? She asked. Vincent stood with his back to her, staring at the blank rectangle the frame had left behind. Making room. For what? Clara asked. A son. He turned then. There was pain in his face, but he did not use it to ask for mercy. For the truth, he said. Clara crossed her arms gently over her stomach. And what truth is that? Vincent looked at the empty place on the wall. That this family has been calling cruelty tradition for too long. That my mother should have been here. My sisters should have been here. The women who kept this house alive should not have vanished from it. Clara said nothing. He continued, his voice lower now. If our child is a girl, she will not grow up believing she arrived as the wrong answer. She will not be a disappointment dressed in pink. She will not be the child people whisper around while waiting for a boy. The words touched something in Clara, but she held herself still. She had trusted words before. Words had led her into a marriage. Words had hidden contracts. Words had cut her open outside his study door. So she answered carefully, I hear you. Vincent nodded once. But you don't believe me. I don't know yet. That truth hurt him. She saw it. But this time, he did not punish her for it. Instead, he said, then tell me what it would take. Clara looked around the room of male faces and thought about how many women had stood in this house with no one asking what they needed. I keep my own lawyer, she said. Yes. I make my own medical decisions. Yes. No one calls this baby the heir in front of me. Vincent swallowed. Yes. If you ever use this child to control me, even once, I leave. He looked directly at her. I understand. No, Clara said softly. You don't, not yet. But I hope one day you do. There was no romance in the moment, no swelling music, no sudden forgiveness. Just a man standing in front of the wall that raised him, and a woman refusing to let him rebuild it around her daughter. Later that afternoon, Luke found Clara in the greenhouse. He stood awkwardly near the door, hands in his pockets. A bruise faint along one cheek where Vincent had struck him days earlier. I owe you an apology, he said. Clara looked up from the chair near the glass wall. For what? for living here and not seeing how lonely you were." Her expression softened. "You were a child in the same house, Luke." "Still," he said, "I should have noticed." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Then notice now. That's how people become better." Luke gave a small nod. His eyes dropped to her stomach. "If she's a girl," he said, "can I teach her how to steal Vincent's car keys?" For the first time in weeks, Clara laughed, a real laugh. Vincent heard it from the doorway. He did not step inside. He did not interrupt. He did not claim the moment for himself. He simply stood there, listening, and understood something that power had never taught him. Family was not something a man owned. Family was the place where people felt safe enough to laugh when he was nearby. That evening, Clara found Vincent in the gallery again. The wall where his father's portrait had hung was still empty. "I don't know if I can love you again," she said. Vincent looked at her, and this time he did not flinch from the consequence of his own actions. "Then I'll start," he said, "by becoming someone you don't have to protect her from." 6 months later, the DeLuca mansion no longer felt exactly like the same house. It still had the same stone walls, the same iron gates, the same guards posted at the driveway, and the same long hallways where footsteps carried too clearly after dark. Vincent DeLuca was still a dangerous man. No one in the city had forgotten that, and he had not become gentle in the way harmless men are gentle. But something in the house had shifted. Not softened completely, not healed, just shifted enough that people could breathe. Clara still lived in the east bedroom. Though she no longer locked the door every night, her office was now the small sitting room beside it, filled with legal files, medical books, and baby clothes folded in careful stacks. Grace visited openly every Thursday, walking through the front door instead of calling from burner phones and parking 2 streets away. Luke had been accepted into a college in Boston, and for the first time in his life, leaving the DeLuca house felt like a choice, not an escape. Vincent had begun moving parts of the port business into legitimate contracts. Clara did not pretend that made him a saint. Saints did not have armed men outside their homes, but she noticed the difference. He asked before making decisions that touched her life. He stopped meetings when someone referred to the baby as the heir. He did not punish her for keeping her lawyer. He did not demand forgiveness as payment for improvement. Sometimes he still got it wrong, but now, when Clara said stop, he stopped. That was where change began. The baby came during a snowstorm in February. By the time Clara reached the private hospital wing, the city outside was white and silent, traffic buried beneath thick falling snow. Vincent stayed beside her until the nurses took her back, and for once, he had no orders to give that mattered. No judge to call, no guard to move, no enemy to threaten. He stood in the hallway with his hands empty, looking almost strange without power in them. Hours passed. Luke sat nearby, pale and restless, pretending to text while staring at the delivery room doors every few seconds. Rose prayed silently with a rosary wrapped around her fingers. Grace arrived in boots, still wet from the snow, and stood beside Vincent without asking permission. When the doctor finally came out, Vincent stood so quickly the chair behind him scraped the floor. The doctor smiled. "It's a girl." The hallway went silent. For 1 second. All the ghosts came back. Vincent's father, Arthur Quinn's toast, the family portraits, his own voice behind the study door, saying he would tolerate Clara until she gave him a son. Then Vincent asked, "Is my wife okay?" Grace closed her eyes. Rose began to cry. The doctor nodded. "She's tired, but she's okay." They both are. When Vincent entered the room, Clara was lying against the pillows, pale and exhausted, with a tiny baby bundled against her chest. She looked at him carefully, the way she still did sometimes, as if measuring whether the man in front of her was the one who had hurt her or the one trying to become better. Vincent did not reach for the child. He waited. Clara saw that. After a moment, she nodded. Only then did he step closer. When she placed the baby in his arms, Vincent's hands shook. The child was impossibly small, warm and sleeping, her dark lashes resting against her cheeks like strokes of ink. He stared at her as if no empire, no port, no name in the world had ever been worth as much as one breath from this little girl. "I spent my whole life being told I needed a son to continue my name," he whispered. Clara's voice was tired but steady, and now, Vincent looked down at his daughter. Now I know my name was never the part worth saving. Clara watched him for a long moment, then she said, "Her name is Margaret Grace DeLuca." Vincent closed his eyes. Margaret for his mother. The woman erased from the walls, the woman turned into sacrifice, the woman whose story had finally been spoken aloud. Grace. For the friend who had helped Clara remember that love was not enough without choices. A few weeks later, Clara walked into Vincent's old study with Margaret asleep in her arms. She had not entered that room since the night everything broke. But the room was different now. The heavy lock was gone. Vincent's father's desk had been removed. Warm lamps stood near softer chairs. A cradle rested by the window. The walls held new photographs, not of bosses or heirs, but of people who had once been left out. Vincent stood by the fireplace. "I once said I would tolerate you for a son," he said. Clara looked at him. "I remember every word." He nodded. "Good. Then remember this too. You gave me a daughter, and she gave me back the part of me I almost buried with my mother." Clara did not say she forgave him, not yet. Some wounds did not close just because someone finally understood how they were made. But she stepped forward and placed Margaret in his arms. And for the first time, Vincent DeLuca held his child not as an heir, not as proof of his power, not as the future of an empire, but as a life trusted to him. The mafia boss had thought a son would protect his legacy. In the end, it was a daughter who broke the curse in his bloodline. And it was a wife, wounded but unbroken, who taught him that no name was worth saving if it required women to disappear. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
The meaning of this story is not only about a mafia boss, a broken marriage, or a daughter born into a powerful family. At its heart, this is a story about respect, inherited pain, and the courage to stop passing wounds from one generation to the next. Vincent DeLuca believed legacy meant blood, power, and a son who would carry his name. That belief did not begin with him. It was taught to him by his father, repeated by the men around him, and protected by a family that confused tradition with truth. But the story shows us something important. Just because pain is inherited does not mean it has to be continued. Clara's strength is different from Vincent's. She does not need guns, threats, or fear to prove her power. Her strength is in her silence, her memory, her patience, and her refusal to let her child be treated as less valuable because she might be a girl. Clara teaches us that dignity does not always shout. Sometimes dignity is quietly deciding, "I will not let this happen again." The moral lesson is clear. Love without respect is not love. Protection without kindness is not safety. A family name means nothing if the people inside that family are made to feel small, unwanted, or replaceable. Vincent's redemption begins when he finally understands that being powerful is not the same as being strong. Real strength is admitting when you were wrong. Real courage is changing before your child inherits your worst beliefs. And real legacy is not the empire you build, but the pain you choose to end. In the end, the daughter Vincent never asked for becomes the reason he learns what love truly means, and Clara, the wife he underestimated, becomes the woman who saves not only her child, but the future of an entire family.